Welcome to the Migrant Resource Centre, Northwest Region Incorporated Diversity and Disability YouTube channel. Your Life, Your Voice program, where self-advocates and professionals in the disability sector are interviewed.
The Diversity and Disability Project would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we work and live and recognise their continued connection to land, water and community. We pay respects to elders past, present and emerging.
Nothing about us without us. We pay respects to all self-advocates who have worked hard over the years and still working tirelessly for their rights, supporting others with disabilities and human rights for all.
This channel is for people with disabilities who aspire to seek self-advocacy role models to inspire change in their everyday lives. Nothing about us without us. Choice and control are central themes. Every interview is as unique as you and I.
And it has our fundamental universal human rights ethos of respect for persons with disabilities, having their views heard and acknowledged. After all, it's all in the name. Your life, your voice.
Be the voice of change in your life.
Good morning and welcome to season 3 of another edition of Your Life, Your Voice. My name is Julie Skiberis and I'd like to welcome my co-host, Claire Thomas. Hi Claire, how are you doing?
Thanks for asking. Hi everyone.
Hi, and today we have Dr. Debbie Ling, who is from the Department of Social Work, School of Primary Allied Healthcare, Faculty of Medicine, Nursing and Health Sciences, Monash University. Hi Debbie, how are you doing?
Hi Julie, hi Goulet, I'm doing very well, thank you.
Thank you so much for agreeing to be part of our program. And how about we start off with some questions?
Sure.
So, Debbie, you are a compassion and common humanity researcher and a social worker. Can you firstly tell us how you came to be doing both of these things?
Happy to. So I actually became a social worker first. So in 1993, many moons ago, I think almost 30 years ago, I graduated from my social work degree. So I've worked in direct practice in lots of different fields of practice, whether it's hospitals, schools, child protection, disability, crisis work, mental health. And about how many years ago now? About 7 years ago, 2015, I decided to do a PhD on compassion and common humanity because it was a topic that I was very interested in, but also I felt that doing a PhD would help advocate more for these issues and perhaps have the potential to have a little bit more influence at the policy level if there's research to back it up and you're seen as a researcher. So I did my PhD at Monash University from 2016 to 2019. And then I've been working as a lecturer in the social work department at Monash for the last 2 years, but I'm also still in practice. So I'm an accredited mental health social worker in private practice. And I also still work at Empathic Healthcare as a social worker occasionally.
Yes. So, Debbie, why do you think compassion and common humanity are important? And how can they help people with disabilities?
So I'm defining compassion as a feeling that arises in response to another's suffering, combined with a desire to alleviate the suffering of the other. So that's a fairly standard, accepted definition of compassion, where it's a response to someone else's suffering. And I think that to be human means we can all have things sometimes not go so well at different times. Other things can go better, but there's a recognition to be human. We're all vulnerable to suffering or sickness at different times. So I think compassion's it's a core value really all around the world. And so I think compassion is very important for all people, whether they people with disabilities as well. And also common humanity is seen as the prerequisite, if you like, or the necessary perspective. If people hold this perspective of common humanity, which is understanding people are all the same at the basic human level, we've all got the same basic needs. Everyone wants to be happy. No one wants to suffer. We all need food, housing. When people have that perspective of common humanity, it builds a sense of closeness and identification with anyone and getting beyond superficial stereotypes. And so common humanity is seen as the perspective that makes it easy for people to have compassion for anyone, because a lot of the problems are often, some people might have a sort of stereotype or a bias based on all sorts of categories. It can be religion, it can be based on voting preferences, ethnicity, gender, whereas common humanity knocks all of that out. In common humanity, we basically see everyone as a human being, just like me. There's this sort of sense of group identity. So it's a very powerful sort of pro-social perspective. So that's why I think common humanity and compassion are really important for everyone, but also for people with disabilities, because it's, recognised that for people with disabilities, there are barriers that need to be addressed. We do need to have ongoing work at policy level, advocacy level, programs like this wonderful program both you and Julie are doing. All of that's important. And I think it's really helpful just to remind everyone, also in the general public, that to connect to and remember our shared humanity. When people think like that, they tend to have more care and respect to all others, irrespective of difference.
How do we, sorry, Julie, how do we get that common humanity? I'm thinking, that's a really important value and what you explained to us, but how does one acquire common humanity and shared humanity values?
Yeah, it's a great question. So as we know, everyone's different. So it appears that some people may naturally have it. And I should just comment here too, as a researcher, it's very interesting. The research space is showing that we're all born with a natural ability to care and connect to others. So it's seen as, it's not just humans who do this in terms of the evolutionary aspect. Lots of animals do it, and lots of animal groups behave cooperatively. So even bees, ants, dolphins, elephants, they actually work together, help each other. So there's an understanding now that it's a fundamental part of being human. We're born with the ability to care, connect, have compassion, and these are seen as essential things just for our survival, and so survival of the species. So there's an understanding that we're all pretty much born with this ability, but as we can see, different people have different amounts of it as they move through life. And so one of the things we're doing with compassion training, so at Monash we've developed a compassion training course at the moment for healthcare workers, but anyone can actually do the course. You don't have to be a healthcare worker. There's been great interest all around the world actually in specifically training people in compassion. And in the compassion training, common humanity is a big topic. So we spend a portion of the course heightening people's sense of common humanity. And you can do that through, I would call them thought experiments. So it's where you start thinking about the interconnectedness we have with other people. So for example, all of us are born helpless as babies. So, in the early years, caregivers, whoever they might have been, would have spent thousands of hours, feeding us, making sure we're safe, looking after us. And so there's certain ways of thinking. Often we don't, certainly in Western cultures, we tend to think of ourselves as more individuals, and we don't necessarily reflect on the deep interconnectedness or interdependence we have with others. So even like today, to be having an interview like this, it requires multiple resources from multiple people, the internet, technology, emails. So there's certain ways of thinking, and there are actually a couple of videos, and I'm happy whether we show it now or later, Gulair, that I think really encapsulate this sense of common humanity and getting beyond the superficial differences. So if you were happy to show them, we could show the Danish TV2 ads.
The connected?
We could actually show
The first one.
both of them. So the first one is called All That We Share.
Yep.
It's a 3-minute ad made for Danish TV, but it shows how easy it is to put people in superficial groups. But if you actually look beyond the superficial grouping, you see that we've all got some very common interests. There's a lot of commonalities between people.
Okay, I'll pop it on.
It's easy to put people in boxes. There's us, and there's them. The high earners, and those just getting by. Those we trust, and those we try to avoid. There's the new Danes, and those who've always been here. The people from the countryside, and those who've never seen a cow. The religious, and the self-confident. There are those we share something with, and those we don't share anything with.
Velkommen. Jeg kommer til at stille jer nogle spørgsmål i dag. Nogle af dem kan godt være lidt personlige, men jeg håber, I vil svare ærligt på dem. Hvem herinde i rummet var klassens klovn? Hvem er bonusforældre?
And then suddenly, there's us. We who believe in life after death. We who've seen UFOs. And all of us who love to dance. We who've been bullied. And we who've bullied others. And then there's us, the lucky ones who've had sex this past week. We who are broken-hearted. We who are madly in love. We who feel lonely. We who are bisexual. And we who acknowledge the courage of others. We who have found the meaning of life. And we who have saved lives. And then there's all of us who just love Denmark. So maybe there's more that brings us together than we think. TV2 Denmark. All that we share.
It's so easy to place people in boxes.
In a minute, we'll show them that they have more in common than they think.
Us. And there's them. Those we feel comfortable around.
Hej alle sammen. Tak fordi I er kommet. Thomas, vil du stille dig der? Og Aske? Thomas, du bor med din familie i et dejligt hus på Vinkelhøj 8 i Viby. Før I flyttede ind, var det faktisk dit barndomshjem, Aske.
Det er rigtigt. Ja. Fodbold i haven om sommeren. Og,
det kan I forestille mig.
Ja, præcis.
Vi laver igen.
Mathilde, vil du komme herop? I to har faktisk stået over for hinanden før.
Okay.
Der var I 12 år. Og de var i en rugbykamp.
Okay, ja.
Kampen endte i øvrigt 42-0. Til Flasketøj.
Tak for kampen. Ja, tak.
Inger. Mathilde, den nat, du kom til verden for 27 år siden på Christiania, var Inger det første menneske, du så.
Var du min jordmor? Nå, fint. Kan du huske det?
Anna, i 2012 er din mand ude at løbe en tur. Pludselig falder han op med hjertestop.
Ja.
Heldigvis er der en, der reagerer hurtigt og redder ham. Knud, vil du komme herop?
Just below the surface, a total stranger can turn out to be someone you're actually connected to.
Det går et stykke tid siden.
Someone who rouses forgotten memories. Like the very first kiss. Someone who reminds you that you're not alone. But that somebody else also has a bulldog named Prebin. Someone like Thomas, who put out a fire at Vibeka's place.
Vi er så taknemmelige for, at brandvæsenet kom så hurtigt.
Someone you've been gaming with for years, but
Kender I to hinanden?
have never met.
Nej.
Altamon, mød Lil Salt.
Det er løgn. Du er topfraggeren. Jeg har fandme kendt den anden i 3-4 år, uden at nogensinde mødt den anden, eller set den anden før. Altså.
If we approach each other, we might find out that we share the same destiny.
Rana og Maha, I kom til Danmark fra Syrien for 4 år siden. Dorit og Jan, I har en lignende historie fra 2. verdenskrig.
Jeg har prøvet at være flygtning, og jeg vil aldrig glemme det. Det har betydet usigeligt meget.
Og Rikke, det var din oldefar, der risikerede sit liv ved at sejle Jan over Øresund den oktoberaften i 1943.
It's easy to mind your own business. It takes a little more effort to mind the community. But doesn't the feeling of having something in common, something that connects us, make it all worthwhile? TV2, all that we share.
Hi, we're back.
Yes, so what a powerful example of connectedness.
Sorry.
Yes, so yeah, I'd like to explore a few things about people with disabilities, and earlier on you were saying about compassion and how important policy is. But I'd like to explore a bit more of on the ground in your practices. So like this organisation that I'm with collaborates a lot with other disability organisations. One in particular is named SARU, which is the Self-Advocacy Resource Centre. They have lots of programs, and because unfortunately a lot of people with disabilities are isolated. Well before COVID, maybe they've had family issues, a rejection. There are groups where their children are taken away because they have intellectual disabilities. And just on the ground, with your work on the ground, I would say that the links between having commonality and compassion is quite a powerful emotion, because then people don't feel alone, and they feel like they can band together and do something about the situation. What are your thoughts on that, Debbie?
Yeah, thanks, Julie. That's a really key point you've made about people not feeling alone. And you're right, with Common Humanity and even just those 2 videos we watched, I think whether they had quite strong Common Humanity messages. When we reflect more and can think about our connections with all others and how all around the world, even if people might be physically alone in their living space, fortunately, people have access to the internet, or can see some of the groups and organizations that are around, or even watching videos like that, you realize that helps build that sense of connection as well. Because I think, we're realizing we're needing to be very flexible about how we connect to others. And there's a lot of positives that come from the internet. And it's very important for people to understand. And I think it helps boost your spirits when you realize that there are lots of people doing really good work out there trying to advocate, people. And in the second video, Common Humanity, the Danish TV2 ad, where you saw essentially a whole lot of people who'd never met each other before, but then suddenly they're realizing, either they lived in the same house or someone helped someone else. I think it can be very important for us to remind ourselves that at one level, there are people helping each other, I say all the time. We've got structures, we've got schools, hospitals, non-government organisations, advocacy organisations. They're all peopled with people who are consciously trying to contribute to the greater good. And I mention this because I think, unfortunately, as we know, a lot of the news can also be skewed very negatively. And there is a lot, there is difficult news, sad news, wars, things like that. But the general comment is that sometimes the news is too skewed the other way. And so then you can get a sense that life and humanity is just fighting and war, whereas there's aspects of that going on. But a lot of life and humanity is also people trying to improve the world, help each other, look out for each other, work at advocacy. So, yeah, that common humanities perspective is very important. And I think it's helpful to consciously focus on our connections with others, but it's also motivating when you see other people helping others. So I think that's one of the keys with those videos as well, is you see people coming to an understanding of their connections to other people that they might not even know. And that also is a positive thing. It's called moral elevation. You feel good when you see other people sort of helping each other or doing a good turn to someone else.
Yes, that's certainly been my experience in the sector. Is, and the whole idea is to empower each other. And I've been involved in a couple of groups actually with other facilitators and as a participant, where they use the connectedness and that particular video we showed of where different elements of our life, and then and one facilitator used a bit of string to show our connectedness. And so it's really important for people with disabilities who may not be in groups to maybe possibly find groups like Saru, or there are lots of self-advocacy groups around Australia actually. And Saru has a great resource where no matter where you are, you can check out different groups in Australia. You can even start your own group. So all you need is 2 people really, and a lot of self-advocacy groups have just started with a goal, a passion, an issue. So and then there's been a groundswell of from one person. There's been a groundswell of people to make life to make life more equal, to empower people with disabilities, particularly in the early stages of self-advocacy, where people were like people were in institutions, and there was a big groundswell of people that got together and change that. So if there's an issue out there that you're passionate about, come to check out our self-advocacy groups. I'm a part of Diversity and Disability, other groups, and see what we can offer you. And at the start, you may feel a bit reluctant to speak, but there's no pressure. We give people a lot of space, and in that time, what you may find is that you develop the confidence to speak up, because you're around like-minded people who are passionate about self-advocacy. So yes, any other comments from anyone?
I think just when you were saying, Julie, too, about building that sense of connectedness, absolutely. I mean, humans, we are born in relation to others. I'm not just talking blood relation, but just once again, our whole society is founded really on different relationships we have with people, big or small. And also to keep in mind, humans, we are social animals. We're a social species. None of us can survive completely on our own. And so I absolutely agree with you. Whatever organisations and resources that are out there to help people connect, get information, meet others are really helpful.
Yeah, just to tease out a little bit about relations. So, a lot of people think that, blood family relations, and they could be if they're good supports to you and you support each other, you have that mutual respect for each other. But sometimes, a lot of the time, in certain groups, that's difficult for people to maintain that closeness. There may be, some sort of abuse, some sort of power struggles happening in the family environment. But that doesn't mean that you're alone. So relations could be your connections at work, your connections in social groups, with clubs that you join, with self-advocacy groups. So I would encourage people who do feel isolated alone to seek out these groups and to build your network, so you do have supports around you that will empower you and encourage you. So that's a really important point for people with disabilities who find themselves alone. And So would we like to move on?
Yeah, I'd like to look at, in society, for example, what makes us connected or not connected, and that actual layer, Debbie, of people with disability. Like, could you take us on that journey?
Yeah, I think there's two ways of looking at it. So obviously, sometimes some people may be born into a situation where there's a supportive family, all the rest of it. Now, that's great if that happens, but as Julie pointed out, and also in my long career as a social worker, I would have to say sometimes family is supportive, but that's not always the case. And obviously, as a social worker, I've worked with many people where family may have also been some of the cause of issues. So in terms of that connectedness, yes, some people might be lucky to have good supports around them, but that's actually not as common as you would think. I would say most people, it's not necessarily the case, and particularly we've just come off 2 years of COVID. So we've been, there's been a lot more in Melbourne, particularly with a lot of the lockdowns, there's been a lot more isolation. And so I think with that connectedness, part of it can also be in our attitude. So if we can consciously focus on thinking about the fact that there are organisations around, join groups, think about some of if there are people in your circle that you can connect with or feel are supportive. When I say it's sort of glass half full, glass half empty, there are certain ways of looking at it that can lift our spirits. But sometimes we do have to make, I think certainly in modern Western society, you do have to reach out, and through the internet and groups, I think that's fantastic, because we know that in the past, people talking decades or even centuries ago, people naturally lived more communally. But these days, a lot more people live in single person households. We may not necessarily work or do activities in our local community. And so it does require that effort. But I think just getting back to your the way you've posed the question, Gulair, I'd like to say that through focusing on some of the commonalities we have with people, you can have a meaningful connection with someone that you never even meet in person. And so once again, that's the strength of the internet. And then, as Julie has said, there have been advocacy policy changes that are actually driven grassroots by a whole lot of people who may not personally know each other, but they're on the same mission, they have the same goal, and through self-advocacy or groups, emails, policy, great things can happen. So it doesn't have to be physically someone that you know and you meet in person, that the connection, it doesn't have to be through that way. There's multiple ways it can be.
Yeah.
Yeah, for the younger audience, I have lots of friends, and one particular friend has a child with health issues, and he was on the internet playing games with people overseas. And then one day he decided to go visit his friend overseas, and that's just a good way to it's a good example of how a social activity online can lead to other connections, and and it built up his confidence in traveling. And he previously travelled with family, but then he built up the confidence to plan the trip, and book accommodation, and check out trend lines and transport. And so just by one single act of gaming, my generation of people think, how could that happen? But with the younger generation, it actually helps them to form connections. And so so that example of the video, it really rang true to me, because I know someone who had actually done that.
Actually, just on that comment you've made, Julie, I have a 16-year-old son who frankly spends most of his time, when he's not at school, on the computer gaming. And I know that he's got all these people he knows that he's only met through gaming, but I can hear them, laughing and talking. And I think it's important to recognise there's multiple ways we can connect with others and connect with humanity, if you like. And even through, it doesn't necessarily have to be watching real life people. It can be through fiction and books and songs and art. Like a lot of these human activities, they often have themes that we can relate to. So part of it's sort of heightening our sense of the fact that we're, for however long we're on Earth, we're having this human experience, and there's many ways to connect with others. But I really like your point too, Julie, about the young man developing confidence. And I think the important thing too is through his gaming, then he got inspired to go overseas. And it's just remembering that life always moves forward, and there's opportunities that come up, and there are lots of interconnections. We might not see them at the time. So when that young man started gaming or started playing that particular game, he may not have even realised that he'd get friendly with someone one day and then hop on a plane and go and visit them. But that's a fantastic outcome. So I guess I'm just highlighting the fact that life is a lot more sort of interconnected than we realise at the time. Or it's even the way I met Gulair. I was invited by Marilla Rao, who's a social worker at St Vincent's. She invited me to participate in a Hope Forum. And Gulaire was one of the other presenters. And so that's how I met Gulaire, and then she's invited me here, and hopefully there'll be some people who enjoy this interview. So you just never know what might lead to what. And I think it's holding on to that sense of potential and understanding that even little moments or things that might seem somewhat not necessarily that significant at the time, they actually can lead on to more significant things. And the final thing that I would like to say too, just on this, is sometimes it can be a conversation with someone, even a conversation, email conversation, or even a phrase that we might read in a book or hear in a song. It can get us thinking, and these things can be meaningful for us, and it might prompt us to go and take another action or think about something else. Sometimes it's joining up the dots. So I guess I'm just trying to highlight that there are opportunities for sort of connectedness and feeling involved in our own humanity, humanity of the human species, and each moment of our lives, every day of our lives, in a way we're sort of building our own story of our life and what happens.
Yeah, something else came to my mind. The boy, the young man that he visited, has some sort of anxiety type issues. So the mother was asking, questions to my friend's son, and because I think she was a bit of an overly protective mother, by the sense, and so by this young man's actions, you don't know how you're actually going to empower others. So one thing leads to another, which turned out to be a really lovely blossoming romance. It's a common phrase used, between males nowadays, and so it developed into something more, which is really lovely to hear. Something else popped into my mind, but I can't think of it at the moment. So how about we move on, Gulaire?
Yeah, I'm looking at, Debbie, like in your observations, I was thinking of gender diversity and fluidity. Like, how does the connecting and the common humanity and compassion happen in groups or individuals? Like, can we explore a bit of that?
Yeah, I think, Gulaire, it's a great question. I think that it's with the common humanity. I think one of the power of it is that whoever it is you're interacting with, and whatever group they might be in, or however they identify, the common humanity always puts humanity first. Like, we're all a human being, and that's the basis on which we form this. We have this sense of shared humanity, irrespective of any other superficial differences. And sometimes I like to quote His Holiness the Dalai Lama. He says, most of the differences are all pretty superficial, but ultimately we're all humans. Everyone wants to be happy, wants to be loved, wants to have a good life. And I think it's really helpful when we can look at each other and ourselves through that lens, because one of the things is, obviously, there are obviously some superficial differences, and I'm not suggesting that they're not important at times, but I think sometimes one of the problems with different categories is it can sometimes lead to some divisions and polarizing views. And I think it's very important, if people can hold on to focusing on that compassion and common humanity, it helps reduce sort of conflict and polarizing views, and it helps provide people with that sense of, we're all here having a human experience, doing our best. Let's see how we can work together forwards on, getting on better or helping each other. And I think that's a really useful way for us to view each other. Whereas, as we know, in real life, sometimes the divisions can really start, pushing people apart, and then it gets difficult to have dialogue and has difficult people to understand each other's points of view. Whereas hopefully with the sort of common humanity view, it sort of brings a partners back together again to a degree of thinking, let's look at our common ground. Let's just look at our basic shared aspirations here. We all want to be happy. We all want to have a good life. How can we work together on that?
Yeah, that's like a project that I did last year. And my project was an art project, which is on my website, where I interviewed 10 deaf and disabled artists about their arts practice. And I called it Human First ? And I feel that that was one of my intentions, was to get them there, get people out there with lots of diversity, to describe what it is like for them. And so I've interviewed people with diversity in lots of areas and their art practice. And then there's a key messages bit where they where I collated all their key messages for people who are interested about them and what is important for them. So yeah, I can really relate to this topic and our people. So could we go to training? Is that possible? That go to compassion training? Yeah. So what is it and how can it help staff have more compassion and provide better services for people with disabilities?
So with the compassion trainings, as mentioned at Monash, we've developed a 4-week online course called Compassion Training for Healthcare Workers. And anyone can do it though. You just Google Monash Compassion Training. But it's not just at Monash. Compassion Training, there's a lot of more interest in it, and courses have popped up over the last 10 to 15 years, particularly in the States and in the UK, because there's a recognition, you can train compassion. So research shows that there are certain techniques that you give people and it can heighten their sense of connection to others and compassion for others. So it's worth training. But the other thing too is, particularly with healthcare workers and workers in organisations, I think there's, and my background, I've worked a lot in hospitals, there's a recognition that some healthcare organisations and other organisations, they sometimes, I think it's not necessarily deliberate, but I think it's easy for some of these big organisations to become a bit dehumanised and lose sense of the humanity of people. And that can happen through certain policies being brought in place, or certainly hospitals are big, busy places. And I understand they're doing the best they can. They're trying to help a lot of people quickly. But, you know, anyone who's ever been to hospital knows sometimes it can be not a very welcoming environment, and staff can be very busy. So with the compassion training, it is at the level of the individual. So you're trying to train and heighten individual workers' understanding of, firstly, that compassion is a positive state of mind. So some of this is just educating on what compassion is, because it can get confused between compassion, pity, empathy, sympathy. And these are terms that are often used interchangeably, whereas compassion is different to pity. Pity is sort of looking down on somebody, whereas compassion is a sense of honouring the other's humanity. There's a sense of equality. It could be me, you know, we could be. So compassion involves a sense of respect as well. And there's also a crucial difference with compassion and empathy, which we now know from functional MRI studies showing that when you're confronted with someone who's suffering, empathy is where we can have a feeling resonance with the other person. But if the other person's in high distress or suffering, we can accidentally go into, it's called empathic distress, where, and I'll use the term, the worker in this case, I'll give you an example of a healthcare worker. The healthcare worker might accidentally pick up on the distressing feelings or become distressed themselves. And empathic distress is it's personal distress, it's what leads to burnout. I'll give an example. Let's say there's a car accident on the road and a passerby arrives at the car accident at the same time as the ambulance person. Let's say there's a little bit of blood and injured people. The passerby, understandably, they might get a bit queasy at the sight of blood or get overwhelmed by, I don't know what to do, I can't help. And so they might have to walk off to compose themselves because they're feeling distressed. Whereas the ambulance person is trained to keep their focus on the other and alleviate the other's distress. And keeping in mind, the ambulance people have had advanced training in what to do in those circumstances. So it's understandable if we get empathic distress or we ourselves get distressed. But it's very important for people working in the space to understand this difference, and not just healthcare workers, just in general. So someone actually on the compassion course this morning, they gave a comment that their 2-year-old slipped over in the wet bathroom on the floor and started crying. They weren't injured seriously, but they did start crying. And this woman, she's a mother, she said she noticed that sometimes she'll go into, say, like a guilty feeling. Oh, it's my fault, I didn't have the floor dry. But she said she was aware that she was able to just focus on her child. The child's injured, suffering, I'll just comfort the child. And so not get caught up in those sort of self-focused distress feelings. So this is very important because it's now understood that the term compassion fatigue, that's been bandied around a lot for 20 years, it's actually considered to be incorrectly named. We now know from the functional MRI studies, compassion is a positive state of mind that also improves the well-being of the giver. But compassion is obviously good for the receiver if the healthcare worker has a compassionate response that leads to more caring actions. So it's very important for healthcare workers or anyone to understand that difference and to understand that compassion resources yourself. It's actually good for you as well as for the other. So I got a bit technical there, but just it's quite important because the term empathy has been around for a lot longer. And empathy is a natural ability we're born with. It's very important. And we can have empathy for all sorts of emotions that others feel. If someone's happy, we can have empathy for that, which is great. But the problem is if other people are suffering, and if you're a very empathic, emotionally resonant person, you might accidentally pick up on some of that, those suffering feelings, distressed feelings. It's called emotional contagion when we do that. And people can accidentally start to feel burdened, or I don't know what to do, or I want to get away from this person. That's empathic distress, or another term for it is vicarious stress or personal distress. And so understanding that distinction is very important. Whereas if we can just train ourselves to, when we're with someone who's distressed, if we can remember that the best thing we can do for ourselves and for the other is to just focus on them with care and concern, which is compassion, that's like a win-win for both of us. It's good for us, but it's good for the other.
Because they're all the things I've been thinking about while you were talking. I'm thinking of someone like people with a disability and diversity, and how vicarious traumatization that may be happening to those first responders that you mentioned before, but also with a person with disabilities retelling their story all the time and wanting to elicit, compassion. What could someone with a disability say to someone for them to understand them and connect to them? Like what scenario example could you give us?
Actually, that's a really important question, Goulet, and it also connects to something that Julie was saying earlier, where I was thinking, I think your question gets to the heart of the issue for people with disability and diversity, or anyone who's suffering for any reason. I think there's this middle line that's needed between understanding and recognizing that the situation is difficult and the person might be suffering or, feeling some distress. But it's also being able to recognize that if we stay in that orientation for too long, it's distressing for ourselves or could be distressing for others, and then we start to burn out. So it's a middle line between recognizing that there is a problem and a difficulty, but also with compassion. Compassion does have a focus on trying to find solutions. It's more action-oriented, whereas empathy is more feeling-oriented. And although empathy is important, if we just stay in the empathy feeling response, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to motivate an action. Whereas compassion is always looking at how can I alleviate the suffering? What's the most constructive thing I can do here? how can I help someone else? And so that is where it's helpful, I think, for people with disability or diversity when they're trying to communicate with someone else. It's getting that balance between explaining their situation and some of the disadvantages and difficulties they might have, but it's also perhaps trying to frame these are some of the ways forward. This would be helpful, or so it's getting that combination. But I think perhaps Gulair and Julie, you guys have more experience in this space, lived experience. And see what you think. I'm saying my view is I think there needs to be a bit of a balance, and can be a little bit tricky. But if there's too much of one without the other, then it doesn't quite work.
Can I give you an example? Quite a long time ago, I became quite ill, and I had a sibling who basically took on the carer's role for a young age, and I had my best friend. And my best friend displayed, as you correctly said, compassion, and my sibling was more of a pity type of reaction. And look, I totally understand what you're saying when you have that downward emphasis on the person that is suffering, how it can lead to burnout. And so, but on the other side, the person showing compassion and motivating me to get better, and positive encouragement, and it did take a long time to get better, but I can see the difference. I can see in my lived experience, I can see that real difference. And so that's a really interesting now that it's recognised in policy, because it's really important. From a carer's perspective, a lot of people out there are carers. Having that understanding of try to protect yourself, to not get burned out, and try to empower the person to live their full life. So I think this conversation can go a long way. And on the topic of carers, is this program advertised within carer type of groups like Carers Victoria? Because I think it'd be quite valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, there's been this huge interest in compassion training, and it's not just in healthcare, it's really percolating everywhere. It's helpful for the general public, but you're hearing it pop up in schools, leadership, politics, absolutely in the carer space, because I think we can all benefit from it. And as you've said, Julie, there's a big difference being on the receiving end of someone's compassion versus someone's pity. And that's why, for example, hospitals, they often have compassion as one of their core values. I'm yet to see a hospital where it says, our core value is pity, we'll give you pity. Because you can see there's that looking down. Whereas with compassion, because it incorporates this aspect of common humanity, there's this absolute understanding of we're all in this together. We're all human, just like me. This person wishes to be happy, not to suffer. And so it's with the compassion and common humanity space, it's really building that sense of absolute care and connection to anyone else, irrespective of whatever superficial differences are going on.
I'm also amazed.
Sorry.
I was going.
I was just going to say, Gulair, sorry, one other thing I forgot to mention is compassion's also been shown to help reduce the desire to, when I say punish someone else, I think often people with disability and diversity, maybe, it can get frustrating, and sometimes we can might feel angry if someone hasn't understood. And it's just that recognition too, to try and have compassion to the other person who doesn't understand. The compassion's been shown now to be, it helps knock out anger and resentment and other things that aren't so good for our health. I'm not saying that we don't need to have people with strong opinions and commitments to keep doing the important self-advocacy work, But I'm just commenting, it's now understood that anger, resentment, feeling frustrated, they're not so good for our own health. So it's just, if we're on the receiving end of other people who don't understand our situation, being able to generate compassion towards them does help ourselves. Sorry, Gula, I interrupted.
No, that's important. What you said is really important, Debbie. I was sort of trying to put look at it in the flavour of culturally and linguistically diverse people with disabilities or carers. Is there like cross-cultural issues with compassion and empathy and connecting?
Yeah, briefly, because I'm just aware of the time. I think I would say we recognise that if there are people may not speak the same language, it can require some extra work to try and communicate with each other. And I guess just particularly if someone is a worker in the space, but even a care, but each and every one of us just recognising that communicating with another human being, it can be a sensitive dance as well. But I think if our baseline perspective is there to try and understand the other, connect and support them, usually you can get some good progress. But I absolutely agree that there can be certain things in place that can make it more difficult. And it can be more difficult if you've got culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. You need to make sure people can understand what's been said. And that's where I think there's great responsibility on the organisation's policy. And we've come a long way, but there's still a way to go to keep improving access, whether that's across diverse languages, but, in all sorts of issues, just to improve the access for all people.
Do Monash provide material in community-based languages?
For the course that we've set up?
Yeah.
No, unfortunately not yet. It's the first run of the course, and so it's all in English, but down the track, I think that's a great point. But no, at the moment it's an online course, it's all in English, and we're just piloting the first run to see how much interest there is in it.
Yeah. Claire, would you like to have any other questions?
Have you got any other questions? I can wait a bit if you, yeah. We've got a few minutes, and I just wanted to think about how fortunate we are to be able to look at this space and move it forward like this positive ball that's going to create in Australia, in Melbourne. Like you said, it's the first training that you're having. I just wish it can be rolled out to more people that are in influence and writing policies and people with a lived experience to be able to access that and then be able to articulate for themselves in an advocacy way. Yeah.
I'm happy to report, Gulaire, so far there seems to be a lot of interest in this, and just as a compassion and common humanity researcher in this space over the last 5 years, there has been a lot of interest. And I think, in many ways, when I say the world, I suppose I should be more realistic here. Certainly in healthcare, the space I know well, there seems to be a thirst for approaches and discussions where it is talking about our humanity and factoring that in. I think there's a general recognition that for a whole variety of reasons, sometimes it's easy for that humanity to get lost. And I think that's part of why there's so much interest in the compassion training, and also the recognition too. We've all been through COVID. There's been quite a lot of other difficulties. The COVID experience has heightened everyone's understanding of common humanity all around the world, because COVID doesn't discriminate. Anyone you can be the Prime Minister of a country or President. The Queen can get COVID. So if there's a positive from COVID, I think it's really heightened this sense of common humanity, and it's also heightened the sense that countries all around the world are in their own ways doing their best to try and meet this challenge. And I think that can that can be a useful thing to focus on as well, although there's a lot more work to do, and particularly in the disability and diversity space, there is a lot more work that can be done. But having said that, I think it's helpful to also recognise a lot of the great work that's already been doing, and great things like this interview and the YouTube channel that you've both set up and put a lot of work into. All these things count. They're all meaningful and useful.
Would we be able to invite you again, and maybe you need to talk to some people about giving us a little skeleton version of what that training could be?
I'd be delighted to.
Yeah,
and Julie. So you'd like to? I'm happy if you wanted to have like a questions or Zoom webinar or whatever. Yeah, that would be great. Fantastic.
Great.
Yeah, and I know we're running out of time, but just a quick question, and you probably can talk for a long time about this question. But with the gender breakdown of your participants through this course, is it skewed to one type of gender balance? I know that genders are very it's probably going to be outdated over time because there's lots of gender diverse type of pronouns that are coming into our space now. But for now, let's just say, is there like a bit of a breakdown on that, Debbie?
Actually, I don't know, Julie, because all I know is numbers in the course. I don't have any other data, but I know in healthcare and a lot of the healthcare professions, I think there's a dominance of people who identify as female, so like nursing, social work, they often, but no, I can't comment. I don't actually know the actual breakdown of the course.
Well, we have come to the end of our interview, and we could speak for hours with Dr. Debbie Ling. So thank you so much, Debbie, for accepting our invitation, and hopefully we can have you back with another set of questions.
It's been my great pleasure.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you very much. Claire, would you like to play the outro, please?
Yes. Catch us on Your Life, Your Voice YouTube channel live every Monday fortnight or on demand.
We would like your comments and suggestions on topics that you would like us to explore. Leave your comments on YouTube comments section.
Please feel free to email us on dndyourlifeyourvoice@gmail.com or contact us via the Migrant Resource Centre Northwest Region Inc. Phone number 1300 676 044. 1300 676 044.
Diversity in Disability is a project of the Migrant Resource Centre Northwest Region Incorporated, and would like to thank the management for funding this project, especially living through the COVID-19 pandemic. The pandemic has been difficult for people with disabilities living in